So this is another installation in my presentations about Rome. So give me a second while I skip through my slides to get to the right place. So you should have already watched the one where I talk about the Republic of Rome and give you a little brief history of the Roman Republic and then the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. Then I have one where I talk about the 4 styles of Roman painting, also sometimes called Pompeian painting. And then I have one that's about the early empire. And so today we're going to talk about the High Empire, and then I'll record a final one about the late empire. All right. So this is the painting, that's the early empire. We talked about Octavian Augustus a lot last time. He's kind of an important dude. Talked about aqueducts and Nero and the Colosseum, and we talked about these guys, the Flavians. Aha, here we are in the High Empire. Okay, so we ended last time talking about the Flavians. Okay, so we had Vespasian, and then we had his son Titus, and then Titus's brother Domitian. Domitian is assassinated, he's murdered, and so then the Senate has to appoint someone to replace him, because that was the end of the line of the Flavians. So the Senate appoints Nerva. So we have Nerva, and then Nerva doesn't have an heir, so he chooses Trajan to be his successor. Trajan is a very popular general, so let's take a peek at Trajan, and we're going to talk a lot about Trajan and Hadrian today. Okay, so this is the Forum of Trajan. Let's talk a little bit about this. So Trajan is Spanish. He's the first emperor who comes from outside of Italy. Remember, Spain is part of the Roman Empire at this point, so the Roman Empire is quite expansive all the way around the Mediterranean. But still, up to this point, we haven't had a ruler of the Roman Empire who comes from outside of the area we know today as Italy. So it's kind of a change-up. It's kind of a big deal. And he's appointed, so he's the first non-Italian emperor, which is big. He's also appointed, he's a general, okay? So he's not someone who was part of a dynasty. He wasn't someone who inherited this line from his father. He was chosen because he had a really good track record, which is kind of familiar, right? Because last time we were talking about Nero, everyone kind of hated Nero. He was not very good at ruling. And so when he dies by suicide, because he knew they were going to assassinate them, they replace him with Vespasian, right? So Vespasian was a general. So it's kind of a familiar thing when we're out of people, because Nero was the end of the Julian line, so we have the end of the Flavian line, and now, like, who should we appoint? And here's Trajan, this general who's popular, who has a lot of successes under his belt. So he does a lot of smart things to get the people kind of on his side from the get-go. So one of the first things he does is he remodels the Circus Maximus. The Circus Maximus is where they do chariot racing, which is very, very popular, and it had kind of fallen into a little bit of, not disrepair, but it was in kind of bad shape. So he redoes that and reopens it. One of you is going to write a little bit about that for your discussion post. He also oversees the construction of new bathhouses that are right by the Colosseum. So that's another, bathhouses were a public thing. So it's another kind of thing for the people that makes them happy, that gets the populace on your side. And then he creates a new forum, which we have quite a few forums. It's getting a little crowded with forums in Rome now, right? Because we have all of these forums being created by different emperors. So he wants to build his own forum as well. It is huge. I talked last time about how Octavian Augustus's forum was very large, was larger than the one that he completed for Julius Caesar. This one is 2 times the size of Octavian Augustus's forum, so it's just a massive building, okay? And it was designed by a guy named Apollodorus of Damascus, so we know the architect's name here, and he comes from the East, as you can tell by his name. Damascus is in the Middle East, right? And he's very well regarded. He's very famous in his time. And we can see that the structure is not dissimilar from what we've seen in forums in the past, particularly Octavian Augustus. But there's a few more kind of flourishes. There's more of these semicircular exedra. Octavian Augustus has had 2, this one has 4. So we have a little bit more development. You can see also that the arrangement of things is slightly different. So we have this basilica. The basilica is a very important structure in Roman society. Later, when we get into the Middle Ages and into the Romanesque and the Gothic eras, we'll talk about basilicas in terms of a kind of floor plan and a kind of design that's used for cathedrals, which is like really big churches, right, that are the seats of bishops. But the origin of the word basilica is in this time, is in the Roman times, and this is it's an administrative building. So it's not a religious building at all. It's kind of a grand hallway where there are government people who work for the government doing their work, and it's also where people would come to talk to people who are in the government to kind of voice their concerns. It's kind of like a city hall almost, kind of like our city hall today. This basilica in Trajan's form is called the Basilica Ulpia. Ulpia was his last name, so his name was Trajan Ulpia. So that's why it's called Basilica Ulpia. It's named after Trajan. And it's in ruins today, as is most of the forum, but we still have some of the elements of this, including the column of Trajan, which I'll talk about. I'll point out a couple more things here. So you see behind the basilica, basilica's number 4 there, we have the 2 little buildings marked 3. Those are the libraries. So he made public libraries that were attached to the basilica that were open to the people in Rome. And then behind it we have a temple. And then we have in that little courtyard there, that's where the column of Trajan is. We're going to talk about that some more in a minute. And then in the actual forum itself, which is that open area that's kind of like a city square, except in Rome it's not really a city square because there's quite a few of these forums, right? So they can't all be right in the middle of the city. But it's a big public open space where people can gather, right? And in the middle of that, number 6, we have an equestrian statue of Trajan. Okay, so let's talk about his column a little bit. So this is what the forum looks like in present day. So you can see we have some of the columns that were part of the original structure still intact, but largely it's pretty much destroyed. But the main column of Trajan does still stand, and that is what we are going to look at and talk about now. This thing is pretty large. It's 128 feet tall. And it's really interesting. If you can see, if you look close at it, you can see how there's relief carving, which I have close-up images of here, but they kind of go like this. They go like as a spiral all the way up. So the frieze, remember the frieze is like the relief carving that would be in the entablature on a Greek temple. So this is a frieze that winds all the way up the column to the top. And so there's 625 feet of friezes wrapped around this 128 foot tall column. And it's pretty neat. It's narrative, and it shows all of his deeds basically in his life. It's kind of like the triumphal arch of Titus that we looked at that showed, you know, his conquests in Jerusalem and also showed some of his battles and things. So this shows a lot of things from Trajan's life as a general before he was the emperor, and then things that he does while he's the emperor are all depicted in here. But it's really interesting because it's this kind of new way of creating a longer narrative in a smaller space using a frieze, and it's carved all the way up, and it's not super high relief, but it's pretty detailed and has a lot of relief carving, as you can see. Okay. So this was also designed by the same architect, Apollodorus of Damascus, and this is the Markets of Trajan. This is still standing today. I've been here. It's pretty interesting. So this housed 2 floors of shops, and it was made out of concrete and had a barrel vaulted structure to support it. That's how it was able to be supported, that it was concrete and had that those barrel vaults and all those nice arches. But it's pretty incredible because it was 2 stories. It was kind of like a mall almost, okay? It was 2 stories of shops, mostly like places you'd buy food or cloth or your meat or your vegetables or whatever, but it was very impressive, a very impressive structure of the time, and it's still standing today. And so it's made out of concrete, then it's faced in these very skinny little bricks that are pretty typical of the architecture of Trajan's time. Okay, let's talk about another guy. This guy is Hadrian. So Hadrian is also Spanish, so we now have a second guy who is the emperor, who is not from Italy, what is now Italy originally. And he's a lover of the arts, he's an avid hunter, he's a writer, he's an amateur architect, he rules for 2 decades. And he traveled a lot. He was very, very educated. He was also a general. So we sometimes Trajan and Hadrian are called the general emperors because they were both generals, or sometimes they're called the Spanish emperors. So here he is. He also is the emperor who has the most portraits of him that still exist. So he had more there's more portraits of Hadrian than anyone ever from the classical time periods. And he's famous for several things. One of the things that he's very famous for, we're going to talk about a lot, and that's the Pantheon. Before we get to the Pantheon, let's also talk about how he was kind of the original hipster. He made beards cool again. So we've had, even with our viewers and portraits of people who are older and balding, they were clean shaven, just like Octavian Augustus was clean shaven, and that was kind of the style for Roman emperors kind of all the way back. Well, Hadrian has a beard, he likes his beard, he has more portraits of him than anyone, so throughout the Roman Empire, beards kind of become in style, and they tend to be the trend for the next 120 years, which is quite a thing. So, let's see. He's only 41 when he takes over, so relatively young. He's always portrayed in all of his portraits as mature with a beard, but he never ages. So it's kind of a return to what we saw before Vespasian, when we had the trend that Octavian Augustus started, where depicted as, in keeping with the stylistic trends of the time as the portraiture moves through time, but always staying as young as he was when he started. So Hadrian always looks this age in all of his many, many, many portraits. And he always has a beard. That is his style. That's what he does. Okay. He rules for 20 years, but he sets trends that stick around for longer than that. So this is what he's most famous for. This is the Pantheon. I'm a big fan of this building. I like the Pantheon quite a lot. I think it's very interesting. And it really changed a lot of things in architecture. It was very different from buildings that preceded it. So one of the things is, look at the shape of this. So the main part of this building is a dome on a drum. So it's a cylindrical building with a dome with an oculus at the top. That's the skylight, basically. Inside it has this really beautifully coffered ceiling. And if you look at it inset in the city, it really stands out. It's quite different looking. Okay, so here's some more pictures of it. Let's talk about it a little bit. So why is it called the Pantheon? It's called the Pantheon because it's a temple to all of the gods. So we've seen a couple of shrines that have been to like 3 of the gods before, and we've seen some spaces where there are multiple people being acknowledged and kind of memorialized. But generally, the temples that we see are to one person, or at most 3 people, but they're usually just to one person. And so this is a new idea. It's like, hey, what if we had a place where we could go worship and honor all of our gods at once? Pan means all, everything, right? So when you take a picture that's in the panoramic setting, it's a bunch of pictures strewn together to make one thing. Same root word, right? Okay, so this is the Pantheon. It's in Rome. It's a very interesting building. It's a very strange building. So one of the things, we don't have the name of the architect, which is unfortunate. One of the ideas behind it, though, was that the dome shape is kind of the orb of the earth the dome of the heavens. So kind of like the heavens descended to earth. Now, I mentioned that Hadrian was an amateur architect, and he was, and we're going to look at something he designed in a little bit. For a long time, historians kind of played with the idea that maybe he was the person who designed this, and it's possible that he consulted on the design and had some ideas for it, but the magnitude of the architectural breakthrough and kind of achievement of this, it would be very strange if Hadrian was the architect. It's doubted that he was the architect because he simply didn't have the training, right? It's the largest dome in the world at the time it is built. The diameter and the height are equal, which is very unusual and kind of almost like a Greek idea, this idea of things being symmetrical. So it's 142 feet high up to the top where the oculus is, and it's 142 feet wide. That's quite large for a self-supporting dome, right, for a structure like this at the time. The coffers, that's what we call those kind of sunken in decorations that are inside the dome. Each of those, when it was originally built, had a gilded bronze rosette at the center. Okay, so like a plate that was really, really shiny, gilded, covered in gold plate. And so that was meant to look like the stars in the heavens. It is also something that would have bounced all of the light coming down through the oculus off of and helped light the space. So it would have looked pretty incredible, almost like big sequins kind of hanging from it at the time it was built. It's also unusual in that most of the marble veneers have survived. So it's interesting because the marble isn't just white marble inside of this, it's all different colors. There's kind of a rosy colored marble, there's some that's kind of greenish, there's some that's kind of gray. So it's multicolored marble, and almost all of the original marble veneers are still there, which is unusual because when Rome falls, one of the first things to go is all the marble, right? A lot of the marble was hauled off and used by other people who conquered Rome. But I think it's maybe just because this building was so unusual and interesting, they wanted to leave it alone. I don't know what the exact reason for that is, but it's kind of neat because it's largely kept all of its veneers. It's dedicated to Marcus Agrippa, and so he built a smaller Pantheon on the same site earlier than Hadrian. So before Hadrian was in power, there was a smaller Pantheon, and Hadrian thought the idea of a Pantheon was really cool, this temple for all the gods, and so he wanted to build one, but he wanted to make it bigger, and he wanted to make it more grand and unusual. So then he dedicates, and you can see on the front of it there, the dedication to Marcus Agrippa, because he doesn't want to totally erase the memory of his original idea, which is pretty cool. So this is, let's see here, this is Hadrian's Villa. So Hadrian did design this, and it's very weird. It's very unusual. So he was a fan of the arts, and he was a fan of kind of, he loved Greek art, he loved Greek architecture, he loved paying homage to classical Greek design, but he also loved to screw it up quite intentionally. So he was kind of a rule breaker as well. He was very creative minded. So this is in Tivoli. It was kind of his country villa outside of Rome. Tivoli is just sort of southwest of Rome, I believe. And so one of the main parts of this is the Canopus and Serpium, which is the pool and the artificial grotto, which you can see kind of behind the pool is this little like artificial cave. And so one of the most notable parts of this villa is this interesting colonnade, which with arch-shaped lintels that goes around the pool. So these are Corinthian columns, and instead of the lintels just being straight like this, they're straight like this, and then they're arched, and they're straight like this, and then they're arched. So it's sort of this playful, interesting rhythm. And previously, when we've seen colonnades with lintels, it's structural. It's holding something up, right? They were designed to make something they always had a functional purpose when we were looking at Greek work, right? So this is purely decorative. It's not holding anything up. It's not connected to anything. So it's this really interesting kind of idea of just putting these decorative, normally structural elements out and by themselves standing alone in a decorative capacity. There were also copies of Greek statues all the way around the pool. So all of the statues were copies of Greek statues that he liked. Hadrian was a big fan of Greek sculpture. So definitely a nod to that classical kind of look. Some people, some historians call this the beginning of kind of a Baroque style, a Roman Baroque. Baroque is something that we'll talk about if you take art history 2 with me. It follows the Renaissance, and it's sort of this opulent, highly decorative, sort of over the top, lots of curvilinear kind of decor period. And so some art historians kind of connect this structure, specifically this colonnade, to some ideas that come around in the Baroque and become really popular. Okay. So it's pretty interesting. It's this weird mesh of respect for Greek architecture and also rule breaking. Okay, let's talk about something in a different part of the world. So this is the Al-Kazne in Petra Jordan in the 2nd century CE. And this, gosh, I hate to even ask. I feel like any cultural reference I bring up in class, you all look at me like I'm out of my mind and tell me that it was made before you were born and why would you know about it? So I mentioned Gladiator, the Russell Crowe movie, in class the other day, and someone was like, yeah, that came out before we were born. It came out in like 2001, so it all made me feel extremely old. So this is from an even older movie. It's not from that movie, but it's featured in it, which was a movie I loved as a child called Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So if you have not seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, go watch Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. It's pretty fun. I really like it. And this this building is in it at the end. And when I ran across this when I was studying art history, I was so excited to learn about this structure that was from this building, this movie I loved when I was a child. So I'm going to tell you about it. So this is really interesting, and I put it here because this is around the same time period as what we were just talking about, and it's in Petra Jordan. So Jordan's in the Middle East. So we went from Tivoli, Italy, all the way over to Jordan in the Middle East. And this is cut directly out of this rock face. So it's pretty wild to me. I connect it to Hadrian's Villa in that this also sometimes gets described as this idea of Roman Baroque, taking these kind of classical elements and then stripping them of their function, using them decoratively, and using them in this kind of bizarre way. So it's kind of an homage to classical Greek architecture, but then making it so it doesn't make any sense and kind of mixing it up with these new ideas. Sometimes gets called Roman Baroque. So this is kind of the classic example of Roman Baroque. Okay, so this is a tomb facade that is cut directly into the sheer rock faces. So this is the color of the rock. It's this kind of really beautiful rose color, and they carved it out directly. And again, like Hadrian's Villa, it's this we have some classical elements. We have some columns here that are Corinthian. They might be composite columns. They're composite or Corinthian. I think they're Corinthian columns. And we have some other elements that harken back to some classical design ideas. A lot of the figures have been worn away by the sand. There were some eagles up at the top, sitting on top of that broken pediment on the second story, and the idea there was that the eagles would carry your soul away to the afterlife. There were also Amazons with those double-headed labrys axes. So there's some interesting kind of throwbacks to other tales from Greek mythology, kind of mixing our metaphors there, having the Minoan labrys with Amazons. It's a little bit jumbled up, but so is the architecture, so I guess it's okay. So let's look at this thing. It's 130 feet high. It's 2 stories. So if we just look, just for a second, cover it up and just look at the bottom story, and you kind of almost think this definitely like harkens back to an idea of a classical Greek temple facade. I mean, it's obviously not open on all sides on the peristyle like Greek temples, but we have 6 columns. We have a pediment. We have a kind of frieze. But then you look at it and it's like, well, there are 6 columns, but they're Corinthian columns, which is later, which is Hellenistic. There is a pediment, but it doesn't fit. It's not big enough. It doesn't fit over all 6 columns. It only fits over 4 of them. And also, if you look at the spacing between the columns, it's irregular. There's a different amount of space between each of those 6 columns, which, of course, the Greeks, everything was extremely intentional and mathematically laid out, which is kind of interesting. So it's definitely an homage to some of these ideas, but it's not copying it verbatim, right? Okay. We also have, on the second story, we have this interesting sort of temple within a temple. So we have this little round element that kind of looks like a tholos, but then we have it set within this other structure that looks like the front of a temple again, but with a broken pediment, this time with a tholos set in it. And it sort of looks like this, doesn't it? Do you remember this? This is when we were talking in a previous lecture about the 4 styles of Roman or Pompeian painting. This is from second style, and I think it's kind of a striking resemblance here. This is sort of one of those fantastical second style architectural paintings that doesn't really relate to anything that had been created at the time. Voila, here it is. It has been created. They just had to wait several hundred years. So that's kind of interesting. Another thing about this that I enjoy is that there are lots of different legends surrounding it, which I think is kind of neat. So one of them is talking about the legend that comes from the Old Testament, which is with the Egyptian pharaoh who is pursuing Moses, chasing Moses, who's leading the Jews to freedom out of Egypt, where they were enslaved. So the pharaoh, in this legend, the pharaoh is pursuing Moses, and he actually makes it across the Red Sea. So in the traditional legend, he does not. But the idea is that he was still chasing Moses, and he needed to put all of his treasures that he had presumably brought from Egypt somewhere. So he used magic. He was a magical Egyptian pharaoh, and made this to be a safe place for his treasure. Okay, so that's one legend. Another legend claims that pirates hid all their treasure in that urn on top of the thing that kind of looks like a tholos, that it wasn't actually solid sandstone carved out of the side of the cliff like everything else, that it was actually a vessel that was hollow and had treasure inside it. And there's actually, if you look at it today in contemporary times, there's a bunch of bullet holes in it from people shooting at it trying to get the treasure to spill out, which is sad and unfortunate. So it is because of these kind of legends that it gets its name, Al-Khazna, which literally means the treasury. Was it a treasury when it was originally built? No, it wasn't a treasury. It has nothing to do with being a treasury. It was actually a mausoleum and a crypt in the 1st century. But because of these kind of mysterious legends that were brought up around it, we have a different name for it, which is kind of interesting. Here's just a more detailed look at some of the carving on that second story. And then here's an image from inside. So I was always kind of sad that the inside, I mean, still think carving this out of a rock face, this is incredible, right, that this exists in any capacity, but this is what the inside looks like. I always kind of, in my brain, wanted it to be like super elaborate. I think it's really beautiful. The rock kind of looks like Jupiter, looks like the surface of Jupiter to me. It's really incredible. So it's a very cool place. I have never been there. I would love to go. Okay, let's talk about something else. So another development that happens during this time, with Hadrian as the leader, is the idea of the Insulae. So the I-N-S-U-L-A-E is the plural, insula is the singular. So what is an insula? Well, it's a term that is something I lived in for part of my life, and maybe some of you live in now, and that's an apartment building. So this is where we see kind of the advent of apartment buildings, because the population in Rome is growing so drastically. There's so many people. So one of the ideas was to move out into the country away from Rome, the capital itself, but still have somewhere where you could live that was affordable and that had all kinds of your needs met in one place. And so we have the debut of these insulae. So this is concrete that's faced in brick, just like Trajan's markets. This is sort of a staple of these the Spanish emperors that we've been talking about. They both have, this is kind of something that's common during their reign of Trajan and Hadrian. So we have concrete, everything structurally made out of concrete, and then faced in these little skinny bricks. This is one of the apartment buildings in Austria. So this is right outside of, not right outside, but it's a little further out in the country than Rome proper, okay? And so it would have had your apartment buildings at this time. You had your standard, your kind of living areas for everybody who lived there. And then you would have things sort of similar to a lot of contemporary apartments, especially in larger cities, where you'd have your bathhouse, which is kind of like your pool today, right? And your sauna, that kind of thing. And you'd also have marketplaces that were kind of attached. So it was this kind of idea of the development of ideas about like urban planning, right? So above in this insula, we have the Neptune and creatures of the sea mosaic. This would have been in the bathhouse, on the floor of the bathhouse. So you can see there's Neptune, who in Greek is Poseidon, right? With his hippocampus pulling his sea chariot, and then we have all kinds of sea creatures and people surrounding him. It's still in really good shape, which is pretty rad. And then you can see the ruins of the apartment building themselves. So one of the things that's interesting is because of funerary reliefs from this time, we know kind of a lot about the different sorts of jobs that people had who lived in these kind of planned communities around these apartment structures. So they had, like I said, stoas, which is like the marketplace. So you'd have people who are your vegetable vineyards and your butchers and all that kind of thing. You'd also have service providers. So when people died and had funerary reliefs carved related to what they did, sometimes it would show their profession or some profession that related to where they lived or what they did. So here's a couple of examples of that from Ostia. So we have this guy who is a vegetable vendor. So here he is in his little stall at the market that was connected to the apartment building with all his vegetables he was vending. And then we have this woman who is a midwife, so she's delivering a baby here. So it's really interesting because we have this kind of planned community with all these people who have different roles who are living in this area together. Okay, what else are we talking about today? Okay, so this is Marcus Aurelius. So Marcus Aurelius, in 138 CE, Hadrian adopts Antoninus Pius. One of you is writing about, I think, a portrayal of him. And he rules for 23 years. And then he adopts Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, who become co-emperors. And this line of people from Antonius are called the Antonines, okay? So we're still in the High Empire. So this is Marcus Aurelius. He's pretty famous. He had several of these kind of larger than life portraits. This is his equestrian portrait. What does equestrian mean? It means he's on a horse, right? Equestrian refers to horses. So it's interesting because this is the original bronze sculpture. You may have noticed that we don't have a lot of those. A lot of times we have copies in marble or later bronze copies of original bronze sculptures. And that's because most of them were melted down and turned into other things. This one was not melted down, which is pretty unusual because this thing is huge. It's 11.5 feet tall. So why wasn't it melted down? Well, a lot of people think that it wasn't melted down because people mistook who it was. So they didn't melt it down out of respect for who they thought it was, which was not Marcus Aurelius. They thought it was Constantine. So we're going to talk about Constantine later, and you'll get an idea of why he's such a intimidating historical figure that people didn't want to melt down his statues. So this is Marcus Aurelius, it's not Constantine, but he sort of luckily survived. Okay, it's cast out of bronze, very large. So Marcus Aurelius was an interesting leader. He was also kind of scholarly. He wrote a book called the Meditations, and this is something that was a philosophical text, but it was very moving, it was very emotional, it was sort of a bearing of his soul. And this is true of how the artworks portraying him look as well. So beyond just verism, which of course is this idea of showing things very realistically, showing people aging, showing their wrinkles, showing their hairlines recede, showing scars, that kind of thing. The sculptors who portrayed Marcus Aurelius were interested in showing emotions and showing this expressive quality. And in this we see that he found ruling very burdensome, and it made him kind of world-weary. And he has that look in his portraits from when he was the ruler, which is pretty unusual. It's a strange way to be portrayed. Like here's another example. So this is Marcus Aurelius. This is from an arch that was dedicated to him that has been lost to time. It was destroyed over time, but we have this portrait of him, and he just looks so sleepy and over it. Like I just think it's kind of a funny portrait of a ruler. Another thing I want to point out is back when we were talking about the Flavians and that wild stacked hairstyle, and I told you about the invention of the corkscrew drill that was used in addition to a chisel to create those curls. That's also used here for his hair, and it's also used to make those indentations in his eyes that are supposed to give his eyes some depth, but to me sort of look like deep pits of despair. He looks really sleepy. So it's an interesting shift. It's kind of a big shift, because this is one of the first times we're seeing real emotional content in our figures, and it's kind of a big shift away from some of the modes that we've been working within in the classical time. Another shift culturally is the move from cremation to burial. So around this time, people start being, the cultural preference is no longer to be cremated, but to be buried. And since people want to be buried, they need coffins. And a lot of people wanted sort of fabulous coffins. And so the coffin industry becomes a big thing. So what do we call these stone coffins? We call them sarcophagi, right? Or a sarcophagus is the singular. We've talked about these throughout the history of art. There have been iterations of these. You may remember the terracotta ones that the Etruscans used. So these are really fascinating things to me. This one's cool. It's in Cleveland, so if you're in the United States and you are over in Cleveland for some reason, you can go to the Cleveland Museum of Art and see this. I'm not sure why it's in Cleveland. I don't know how it got there, but that's where it is. And it's really interesting because it doesn't tell us anything about the person who is supposed to be buried inside. So oftentimes we'll have something relating to who's inside. When we look at the Egyptian sarcophagi, when we look at the Greek sarcophagi, when we look at, or not the Greek sarcophagi, when we look at the Etruscan sarcophagi, we usually have something that tells us about who's inside. The Minoan sarcophagi that we looked at, this one has nothing to do with the person buried inside. So this is the story of Orestes. So Orestes was Electra's brother. We talked about them back in the prehistoric Aegean. So basically, Orestes slays his mother, what's her name? Clytemnestra, something like that. Anyway, so he slays his mom. He kills his mom because she was cheating on his dad with Aegisthus, and anyway, he's avenging his father, so he kills his mom. Okay, so gruesome story, very sad, family strife carried out to the extreme. So this is that story, that Greek myth being, actually pre-Greek myth, being carved in the site of a sarcophagus. This was pretty common. We see these themes repeated on many sarcophagi. And the reason for this was because of the shift culturally from cremation to burial. lots of sarcophagi were needed, and so there were basically factories of artists together who would carve these things and just make them for the general population. So you would go and pick out your sarcophagus, right? So it wouldn't necessarily be related to you, but the style at the time was to have a grand Greek tragedy portrayed on here. So this is something that becomes pretty common. So there's quite a few sarcophagi like this that have these epic Greek myths carved in relief on them. Okay, we are almost done talking about the High Empire, but I want to make a couple of notes really quick. So one, neither of these paintings in the background here are from this time period, but they're both of the same woman. And this woman was Yaya of Cyzicus. So she is fascinating to me. So the next thing we're going to talk about is painted mummy portraits. Remember, Egypt is part of Rome now, and so we're going to talk about that in a second. And so there were a lot of painters necessary for creating these specific type of portraits. And one of the most famous ones was Yaya here. And she was an early master of encaustic painting. So I've talked about Pliny the Elder before. Remember, he was killed in the eruption at Vesuvius. She was a contemporary of his, so she exists well before the time we're talking about now. But he wrote about her. She was one of 5 female artists that he wrote about in his Natural History, where he talked a lot about the history of Rome. So these are 2 much later depictions of people kind of guessing what she maybe looked like, but she was just kind of rad. We don't have her paintings, but she is recorded in other places as being kind of an early master of Encaustics, and she becomes important at this time when trends shift to these encaustic portraits being used for burials. Okay, so I just like anytime there's a woman artist who's this early in history, I think she's worth mentioning. So I put her here because this is where I talk about encaustic painting. She really chronologically goes earlier, but I think it kind of makes sense. So okay, so what's encaustic painting? So encaustic painting, when you talk about oil painting, the pigment, the thing that makes the color, is in the carrier, which is oil. Okay, when you talk about watercolor, the pigment is in water, that's a carrier. So encaustic, the pigment is in wax. So it's a layered wax with pigment in it is what this is painted with, okay? There are people who still do encaustic painting. Here, our department chair, who maybe some of you have had for class, Kat Alley, is a wonderful encaustic painter. But it goes all the way back to this time period, prior to this time period, all the way back to Yaya of Cyzicus. So we don't know the name of the artist who painted this, but it is done in encaustic. This is a very typical portrait. There are hundreds of these. There are many, many hundreds of these. So this is a mummy portrait of a man. It was found in Fayum, Egypt. There's several large cemeteries from this time period there. And when archaeologists excavated this, there's a lot of these kind of things. So they could be painted on wood like this, or sometimes the encaustic painting was applied directly to marble or on top of marble relief carvings, but this is very typical, being on wood. And a lot of them have been preserved in this district in Egypt. So Egypt becomes a province of Rome in 30 BC, and part of that is there's going to be different culture, right? Different kinds of cultural things happening all over the Roman Empire because it's very, very large, and it encompasses a lot of different kinds of people who have lived in different ways for lots of many, many years. So the Romans tried to kind of homogenize some of the culture, but they couldn't totally get everyone to do everything exactly the same way. So the Egyptians continued their burial traditions despite now being Roman. However, we see some things that kind of cross-pollinate, some ideas that come in from other places. So the stylized Egyptian portrait masks that we saw in tombs that we were looking at when we were talking about ancient Egypt, in some of these communities are replaced with these painted portraits on wood like this. Okay, so this is sort of the European influence, the Roman influence. where we see this kind of encaustic painted portrait instead of the very stylized traditional Egyptian portraiture. Okay, so that's the High Empire. I'm going to stop there, and next time we're going to talk about the Late Empire, and we'll talk about the Severans. We'll start off with the Severans, and then we'll finish up our Roman art history. All right, thanks everybody. Where's my mouse?